Hi everyone, welcome to the video review for Module 2. Module 2 covers half steps, whole steps, and accidentals, and then we'll talk about major scales. So in this video we're going to define a half step and a whole step, be able to recognize a half step and whole step at the piano keyboard, describe the pattern of half steps and whole steps in a major scale, identify accidental symbols, and understand how they alter a note, and also construct a major scale on any note by using accidentals. Okay, so let's first talk about half steps and whole steps, and this is critical to being able to create major and minor scales. And the first thing you need to know is that a half step is the smallest possible distance between two pitches. Okay, and we'll use a piano to show us that, because all the keys on the piano are separated by a half step. So between every white and black key is a half step, and then some of the white keys also have half steps in between them. So any two keys that don't have another key in between them are a half step apart. So that note there, which is an E, is a half step away from that note there, which is an F, because there's no black key in between those two. Okay? And then the ones that are very easy to see are the white notes to black notes, which obviously have no key in between them, so those are also a half step apart. Okay, so a whole step is the same distance as two half steps. So that means that any two piano keys that do have one other key in between them are a whole step apart. So that's like this C here and this D. Because you have a black key in between them, they're a whole step apart. Okay, that F sharp and that G sharp, those two black keys, there's a white note in between them, so they are a whole step apart. And then you can go from a white key to a black key as well, and because there's a white key in between them, those are also a whole step apart. Okay, so now that we know what what half steps and whole steps look like, we can start building major scales, because a major scale is something that divides the octave into 8 parts and uses a specific pattern of half steps and whole steps. And every major scale has this same pattern of half steps and whole steps, no matter which major scale it is. Okay? This pattern of half steps and whole steps is what defines the sound of a major scale. Okay? So starting on the note C, the white notes on the piano create a C major scale. So here's the note C. Okay, and then the next note up is D there. If we keep going with the white notes, we eventually get to that octave. Okay, and you can see that, well, you can hear that it's a major scale. And the piano, all the white notes illustrate the pattern of half steps and whole steps that we use for every single major scale, not just C. Okay? And so the first step in the scale is going to be a whole step. So C to D is a whole step. The next step is another whole step. From E to F is a half step. From F to G is a whole step. From G to A is a whole step. From A to B is a whole step. And then finally it ends on a half step. Okay? And your brain, when it hears these intervals together like that, it knows it's a major scale, right? I can play other notes and it won't sound like a major scale. Right? That doesn't quite sound like a major scale. This one doesn't. Right? Those sound like other things. That one sounds like a minor scale, right? Your brain just knows from the pattern of half steps and whole steps that something is a major scale. Okay? And so we also have sort of other names for these notes, and we call them scale degree numbers. You can see that they're written with a number with a little hat on top. So for C major, we say that the first degree of the scale is C, the second degree is D, third degree is E, and so on. Okay? And then when you get back up to the higher C, we again call that the first degree of the scale. It's just an octave higher. All right. So another way to think about the major scale is as two identical tetrachords. Okay, and a tetrachord is just a half-step, whole-step pattern of 4 notes. So the word tetra, like the game Tetris, means 4 because in the game of Tetris, all those shapes are made up of 4 blocks. That's the same root word. So this just means a pattern of 4 notes. A tetrachord is just a pattern of 4 notes. Okay? So you can see that the first 4 pitches and the last 4 pitches of the scale have the same pattern of half steps and whole steps. So you can see there the first 4 notes go whole step, half step. The last 4 notes go whole step, half step. So those are identical. And they are separated by a whole step in the middle. So that's another way you can think about the construction of the scale. It's a little bit quicker way. Okay, and because this tetrachord is used to build a major scale, we call it a major tetrachord. All right, so the thing to remember here is that a tetrachord is a pattern of 4 notes, and in a major scale we have 2 of the same tetrachord separated by a whole step. Okay? All right, so what happens when you want to build a major scale on a note other than C? Because not all of our major scales are C. Okay? So what we want to do is we want to follow the same pattern of half steps and whole steps. That way our brain knows that it's a major scale and not something else. So we want to build this major scale using the same pattern of whole step, half step, whole step, and then another whole step, half step. Okay? So let's pick a note. How about the note G? So let's see what happens when we try to write the rest of the notes of the scale following this pattern. So the first thing we need is a whole step. So a whole step away from G is A, so that is great. Then we need another whole step, so a whole step away from A is B. Then we need a half step, and it's right there, the next white note, that's a half step. Then we need a whole step away from C, that's the note D, so that works out perfectly. Then we need another whole step, and that is the note E, which is a whole step away. Then we want to have another whole step, so let's try to go up to that next white note there. But now we have a problem because the distance between that E and that F is not a whole step. In fact, it's a half step. So that's not the right interval that we need. If we played this, this would not sound like a major scale. All right, there's that little error in there. That doesn't quite sound like a major scale, does it? Because we have a half step there instead of a whole step. Okay, so that's a problem. And then the next interval, it should end on a half step, but it ends on a whole step between F and G, so that's another problem. So we can't write a G major scale using just the white notes of the piano. We need a way to get to the black notes of the piano. Okay? So what we need to do is correct these incorrect intervals. So we need to fix this mistake in the natural pattern of the keyboard. Okay? And the way we do that is we use accidentals. Okay? Accidentals are used to change the pitch of a note, and for our purposes they get us to those black notes on the keys, on the piano keyboard. So the first one we want to know about is the sharp, which looks like that, and that will raise a pitch by a half step. So let's look at how that works on the piano. So the note C, C5 there, if we put a sharp in front of it, it raises it up to the black note that's right to the right of that white note C. Okay? So that just means it raises it up a half step in pitch. The next one we want to know about is the flat, and the flat lowers a note by a half step. So that note D, lowered a half step, will become D flat, so the black note to the left of it. And you might notice that those are the same note, and this is something we'll talk about again, but this is the idea of what's called inharmonic equivalence. It just means that different notes can indicate the same pitch. So C sharp and D flat sound the same on the piano. So that's C sharp, that's D flat. They're the same note. So we say that they are inharmonically equivalent. Okay, so C sharp and D flat are the same pitch, so they are inharmonically equivalent to each other. All right? We also want to know about the natural. The natural simply cancels previous accidentals, or we'll learn later that also cancels accidentals that are in the key signature. Okay, so if we put a natural in front of our C sharp, it becomes the white note again, C. Put a natural in front of our D flat, it becomes the white note D again. Okay? Then there are some other accidentals that are super fun and slightly confusing, and we'll figure out why we need to use them in a little bit here. But those are the double sharp, which raises a pitch by a whole step instead of a half step. There's also a double flat, which lowers a pitch by a whole step instead of a half step. So if you ever need to write the note A, and you need to call it with the letter A, but you need it to sound like a step that, or something that is a whole step lower than A, you use a double flat. You'd call it an A double flat. And we'll get into that fun stuff later on. Okay, so let's look at how we use these accidentals to fix the problem in our scale we just tried to build. So back to this G major scale, we can use a sharp to correct the last two steps of the scale, because that's where we had a problem. So what we have to do is raise the F natural to an F sharp, and now the pattern will be correct. So we add that F sharp there, and that raises the F natural up a half step. And now we have a whole step between E and F sharp, which is correct. And we also have a half step between F sharp and G. And now this thing sounds like a major scale, because we have a nice half step between the 7 and the 1. Okay? So we are in good shape. Now let's look at some other rules for major scales. The first thing to remember is that all scales begin and end on the note they're named after. So a G major scale begins on G and ends on G. Seems obvious. A D major scale starts on D and ends on D. An A flat major scale starts on A flat and ends on A flat. Okay? Major scales will never have both sharps and flats. Okay? If you're writing a flat major scale, you will never have a sharp in that scale. Minor scales are different, but major scales will always either have all sharps or all flats. They will never mix. Okay, scales must have exactly one of each letter of the alphabet, and we'll see why this is important to know in a little bit. But scales will always use an A, a B, a C, a D, an E, an F, and a G. They could be, an A, B, a C sharp, a D, an E, an F sharp, and a G sharp, but all the letters will be represented. Okay, you'll never have an A and an A sharp in the same scale. And on the staff, scales will always proceed by step, and no steps will ever be skipped. So on the staff, it will always look like you're going up by step. Okay, you'll never skip any intervals. All right, so let's look at some examples. We're going to start with a nice easy one, F major, and we'll talk about accidentals in that. We'll go to a less easy one, D flat major. We'll go to a super fun one, G sharp major. But we know so much about scales now that this shouldn't be a problem, and I'll use a piano at the bottom there to illustrate these. All right, so let me get my pen marking tool up here. Let's see if this works. So we'll do F major in a treble clef. So let me draw the treble clef first. Looks wonderful. Okay, so we want to always start with the note that is indicated, right, asked for first. So we want to find F. So we know that the circle that this treble clef surrounds is G. So if we want to find an F, that's going to be the space below G. So that's going to be this note here. So that's our F. Okay. Now we want to follow our pattern of half steps and whole steps. So the first thing we need to have is a whole step between this note and the next note. So a whole step is going to be, let's use a different one there. It's closer. I think it's actually this one here. So that F, a whole step up from that would be that G. Then we'll want another whole step, which is an A. Then we want to have our half step. Okay, and if we try to write the note B, we'll see that on the piano, that's going to be this note here, and that's actually a whole step, not a half step. So that's a whole step, not a half step. So we need to correct this so that it becomes a half step. So the way we do that is we lower this pitch with an accidental, in this case a flat, because that lowers our B natural to our B flat. Okay, then we want to keep going. So our tetrachord is separated by a whole step, so the next note up would be C, which is a whole step from our B flat. Then we want to have another whole step, which is D. Then another whole step, E. And then finally end on F. So that's our F major scale. Okay. Let's do a little bit more difficult one, and we'll use the bass clef for this guy. This is the key of, or the scale of D flat major, so we just follow the same procedure. I would start by writing the note D flat. And for ones that have a lot of flats or start on flats that seem more difficult, what you could do is you could write out all the notes first, because you know that this has to go up by step here. So these are not quite the right notes, but they are the right places for these notes. So we know we're going to end on a D flat there because this is a D flat major scale. So starting on D flat, the first interval we need is a whole step. So right now we have a D flat, and we need to have a whole step above that. So that's going to be an E flat here. Okay. Then our next one is going to be another whole step. And so F natural, the one that we wrote there, is a whole step, so we're good. Then we're going to need a half step. So we need something that's a half step away from our F natural, and that's going to be that note there. Now you could be asking yourself, well, isn't that F sharp? But remember, only one of each letter can exist in a scale, right? So we already have something that is an F. So this next note cannot be an F sharp. It has to be a G flat. Okay? Because you can only have one of each letter in the scale. Then we need another whole step to separate our tetrachord, which will be an A flat. So G flat to A flat. Then we need another whole step. So A flat. A whole step away from A flat is going to be B flat. Then we need a whole step, and that's going to be B flat to C. And that's exactly what we have. And then this whole thing ends with a half step, C to D flat. Okay, so there's our scale. D flat, E flat, F, G flat, A flat, B flat, C, D flat. Notice that, like I said, one of each letter is in that scale. Okay, we couldn't use F sharp in place of G flat because we already had an F in that scale. All right, let's look at one last one, which will be super fun, and we'll go back to our treble clef. Wow, that was a terrible treble clef. Let's try that again. Slightly less terrible. All right, so let's start this here. We'll go G sharp. Okay, first thing we need is a whole step. And I'm going to erase some of this stuff down here. I'll go away. So we're going to start on a G sharp. So the first thing you want to do is write that in and then find it on our piano. And G sharp is right here. Okay. The next note up needs to be a whole step up from G sharp. So it's going to be this key here. Now, that kind of looks like a B flat. But if I write it as a B flat, you can see that that looks like it skips. Right? We skip one of the steps in the scale, so this cannot be a B flat. Also, we can't have sharps and flats in the same major scale, so we can't use B flat for this scale. The next note up is going to be, in fact, an A sharp, which is the same key and the same pitch as B flat, but it's not the same note. Okay? Then we need a whole step up from A sharp, and in this case, it's going to be this note here. Now that kind of looks like a C natural, right? But that is not the right note. It's the right pitch, but it's not the right note because it looks like it skips a third. And we can't skip thirds in our scale. We have to go up the alphabet, right? So we had a G, we had an A. The next note has to be a B, so we have to find a way to write this as a B. So we can write our B here, but this is going to be a B sharp, because B sharp is the same pitch as this key on the piano. Okay? Then we need a half step. So a half step above B sharp would be C sharp. Okay, because that's really just, let's erase this so it's a little clearer. If B sharp is this note here, C sharp is a half step away from it, which is exactly what we want. Okay, then we want a whole step. So a whole step up from C sharp would be this note here, a D sharp, which also looks like E flat, but we can't use E flat because we can't skip any steps. Then we want another whole step, and a whole step up from D sharp would kind of look like that note there, which might be F, right? But it can't be F because F is not the next letter in the alphabet, right? E is the next letter, so we still have to use E. So we're not going to call that F, we're going to call it E sharp. Right? And we're almost there at this great scale. So the next thing we need is another whole step, which will be some kind of F. All right, so we were on this note here. Now here's the super fun part. So E sharp to F is nothing, right? That's the same note. So we could call this a F sharp, right? But E sharp to F sharp is only a half step. So we need to raise this F even more. So to do that, a sharp is not going to cut it. We need to use a double sharp. Okay, and that double sharp brings this note into, makes it look like this note G, right? Which is a half step away from our last note, which is G sharp. Okay, so there's an example of where you would use a double sharp. Well, that was really fun. Okay, so F major was pretty easy, D flat was relatively easy, and G sharp was kind of a tough one because we had to use a F double sharp there. All right, and the reason we had to do that is because we needed to raise what would look like an F to something that is a half step away from G sharp. So let's go over that one more time. So like this one here was the F natural, right? But we need the F, still needs to be called an F, but it needs to be a half step away from G sharp. So we couldn't make it an F sharp because that's a whole step away. We had to make it F double sharp because that's a half step away from G sharp. Okay? All right, great. Well, now you're all experts in why we use double sharps. So again, if you have any questions, you can post them to the discussion board, or we can go over this in our session, our Zoom session coming up next, in which we will be going over scales with you. But this should get you started on these. Okay? All right, well, thank you so much for watching, and have a great night.